Okay, so welcome back. And in this second lecture, I want to define emerging adulthood. Remember, this class is emerging adulthood, spirituality, and ministry. So it probably is good as if we begin to define this term. It's probably something that you've heard of, maybe not. It's totally okay. But I think it's important in any sort of conversation that we define our terms because that makes a difference in the conversations that we have. So let's go. First of all, how do we define emerging adulthood? Well, I think what we have to do before we can define emerging adulthood is to define adolescence. Now, back in the 90s, David Santruk, was a psychologist, said that adolescence begins with biology and ends with culture. Begins with biology and ends with culture, which sort of makes sense if you think about it. Like on the onset of moving from childhood to adolescence and puberty, you have this sort of beginning of adolescence. And so usually that happened traditionally at age like the teenage years, like 13. And then if adolescence begins with biology and ends with culture, culture is when basically society says, congratulations, you're an adult. We see you as an adult. We treat you like an adult. You have all the benefits and challenges and responsibilities that come with being adult in a way that we go. And so there was a time, maybe a generation or two ago, where at 18, that was sort of the place where you would say one is 18. So you sort of had this transitional period of adolescence of 13 to 18. A lot of times you would hear back in older sort of resources on teenagers of this period of storm and stress. Adults kind of hold their breath. I kind of get through this tipsy-turvy time when teenagers are crazy, and then they finally settle down and kind of get on with life, and then we all breathe a sigh of relief. What we're finding, if we take Santruk's definition seriously, is that actually, if it begins with biology, we're recognizing the fact that biology is starting earlier. Kids are entering puberty at age 10, 9, 8 years old, especially females, for lots of reasons that we don't have time to get into here, but we're finding that that onset is earlier. And then we're also finding this, is that when some researchers ask parents and adults in society, like, when does one become an adult? They will say that one becomes adult when one is 27, 28, 29, let's round it up, 30 years old. Now let's think about what this means for adolescence for a second. If adolescence begins with biology and ends with culture, and all of a sudden we see it expanding on both ends, we've gone from sort of this transitional period where the rest of society holds their breath as teenagers get through it, to all of a sudden a 2-decade endeavor that seems to be a dramatic and key part of a young person's life. Yeah, this is like a big deal, right? Now, to call somebody an adolescent who's 12 or 25 and to treat them the same would be rather ridiculous, right? So as we've pushed on this idea of adolescence, there have been lots of terms that have come around, but around the turn of the millennium, David, you're going to find that Jeffrey Arnett terms this term called emerging adulthood. So we have adolescence, that's ages 10 to 18, and we have emerging adulthood, which is 18 to 30. Okay, these are developmental terms. There's unique things that are happening in these spaces, which we'll get into later in the course. But right now, I just want you to kind of see this big picture. Now let's throw on some other terms just to make sure that we're there as well. Some of you have probably been more familiar with the term millennial, right? Millennials at one point were like the darlings of the baby boomers. They thought they were fantastic. They're getting older now, and now millennials are blamed for everything, right? Whether it's like the crash of the housing market because nobody buys homes anymore, to the fact that nobody like wants to go in the suburbs anymore because they don't have cars, to the fact that they've eaten all the avocados. Millennials are blamed for a lot of things. Now, a lot of times you'll hear people in maybe your circles talk about the millennials and all the problems with them. What's interesting is this, is that millennials right now are a cohort that continues to get older. Right now, their age is 24 to 44. So a millennial isn't necessarily young anymore. They are definitely moving into their mid to late 20s up to the mid 40s. What's come behind them is Gen Z. Some would call it iGen. Right now, their age is about 11 to 24. And so we're hearing a lot about Gen Z and how wonderful they are. That'll eventually change. It always does. But there's sort of the next generation that are sort of moving into the late teens, early 20s, and this cohort continues to grow as well. You might be wondering what's next. We have the alpha or the polars. It's kind of, they're not really sure what they're going to call it yet, but we have basically birth to about age 11. And then in most churches, if you think about it, that when it comes to sort of 20-somethings or those that are considered young adults, it's usually those that have graduated something, high school or college, and they're not necessarily married yet. And young adults sort of fit this space here. Now, let's think about this for a second. If we go back to our definition of adolescence, and we think about young people, we see how dramatic this term is with regards to development, sociology, generational theory, and all that comes with that. And then when we think about this class, where we're really looking at emerging adulthood, we're looking to about 18 to 30-ish. And you can see even here, there are terms that overlap each other. So if perhaps in your particular contexts, you've had people wrestling with who young adults are and what young adults are doing and what they're supposed to be and how we're supposed to treat them and why they're acting a certain way. Maybe it's because it's complicated, period. The complexities that people are feeling and experiencing are actually true. And so what we have to begin to do is sort of understand what's going on here, because then that allows us to perhaps interpret what is actually happening and give better language and approaches and perspective as to how we can show up where young adults say they need us the most. So there's this sort of decade of transition that we're going to talk about in a little bit, but a very simple way to think about it is this, is that we know that emerging adulthood and the path toward adulthood at one time used to be quite linear. As a matter of fact, it's still sort of expected by most adults, where you go to high school, maybe college, you get a job, you get married, and you have kids, and that is the order. If you look at most churches today, this is the way their ministries are set up, right? You have youth group, you have college career, you have newly marrieds, and then you have children's ministry, and you rinse and repeat, and you do it over again. The reality, however, is that most emerging adults are living this sort of life right now, where there's nothing that's quite linear. There's lots of different pathways. There's lots of different challenges associated with them. So the question I think we have to ask ourselves is that we can blame emerging adults for not living a linear life, or we can be more open to the fact that this is the life that they're living, that is quite diverse, that is quite non-linear. Now, we can argue whether that's good or bad. There's probably pros and cons to both. But the reality is we just have to start with what is, because when we start with what is, then we actually see the problem or the challenge or just the reality better, that allows us to start where young people are, where emerging adults are, and to serve them the best way that we can. Okay, so with that in mind, that leads us to just a ministry pro tip that I want to give you. What if emerging adults' lack of church attendance doesn't necessarily mean lack of spiritual interest? What if somehow the linear assumptions that churches have about the way people are supposed to gather just doesn't fit emerging adults? Maybe it's not because they don't care about God. Maybe they just don't feel like they can fit. So what do we do about that? What if we sought out emerging adults where they are, rather than judging them where they are not? I find it so interesting that oftentimes we get frustrated that young people, and especially emerging adults, don't sort of show up where we expect them to show up, rather than asking maybe a deeper question, and that is, well, where are they? What are they thinking about? What are they doing? How are they using their time? It seems like those are the spaces where emerging adults are, and where we can show up for them. And then also remember that the way we frame our challenges shapes our solutions. And I think this is the big challenge that I find as I work with a lot of churches and leaders, that the narratives that they have about emerging adults don't quite fit what is actually happening in their lives. And so they're coming up with solutions that don't fit the actual challenges that emerging adults are facing. And so a lot of my work is re-narrating and helping them see where emerging adults are coming from, because that makes all the difference. So with that in mind, I hope that this gives you just sort of a meta view of who emerging adults are and how they fit with the other terminology. We're obviously going to take a deeper dive, but I think it's important for us to have that meta view. So as you think about those things, remember that they're not just generic people. Remember names and faces. And as you lean into understanding who emerging adults are, may it give you new imagination and new compassion for who they are. And may you know God's grace and peace.